In the autumn of 1944, when the world was tearing itself apart, something extraordinary happened in a small British field hospital that would change 2 lives forever. Picture this: bombs falling like rain, wounded soldiers streaming through makeshift doors, and in the midst of all this chaos, a moment of humanity that defied every rule of war. What would you do if everything you believed about right and wrong suddenly became unclear? When duty clashes with compassion and following orders means betraying your own heart. Tonight, we dive into one of the most remarkable untold stories from World War II, where love bloomed in the darkest of times between 2 people who should have been enemies. This isn't just another war story. This is about Margaret Hayes, a 26-year-old British nurse whose world turned upside down one cold October night. This is about choices that could cost everything, secrets that could destroy lives, and the kind of love that makes you question what it truly means to be human during humanity's darkest hour. By the end of this story, you'll understand why sometimes the most heroic acts happen not on battlefields, but in quiet moments when someone decides to see the person behind the uniform. You'll discover how a single decision made in desperation led to consequences that neither Margaret nor her patient could have imagined. But first, let me paint you a picture of where our story begins. The Whitmore Field Hospital sat on the outskirts of Dover, close enough to the coast that you could hear the waves crashing against the cliffs between artillery barrages. It was one of dozens of temporary medical facilities scattered across southern England, each one a beacon of hope for the countless wounded who arrived daily from the European front. Margaret had been working there since the Dunkirk evacuations 4 years earlier. She'd seen everything a person could see and still sleep at night, or at least she thought she had. Her hands had saved British lives, Canadian lives, American lives, even French resistance fighters who'd made it across the Channel, but she'd never faced a situation quite like this one. The night that changed everything started like any other. The October rain hammered against the hospital's corrugated roof, creating a constant drumming that mixed with the moans of the wounded and the urgent whispers of medical staff. Margaret was finishing her rounds in Ward C when she heard the commotion outside. 3 British soldiers were dragging something through the mud toward the hospital entrance. At first, she thought it was another wounded ally. But as they got closer to the light spilling from the doorway, she saw the unmistakable gray uniform. German, the enemy, unconscious, bleeding, but very much alive. The soldiers who brought him were arguing among themselves. Should they even bother treating him? Was it worth the medical supplies? One of them, a young corporal with tired eyes, kept insisting they had to try. The Geneva Convention, he said, rules of war. But his companions weren't convinced. Margaret stepped forward without thinking. Medical training took over. She could see the wound in the man's shoulder, the way his breathing came in shallow gasps. He was young, maybe younger than she was. His face, pale from blood loss, looked nothing like the monster she'd been told about in propaganda posters. What happened next would haunt her for the rest of her life. As she knelt beside the wounded German, checking his pulse, his eyes fluttered open. For just a moment, their gazes met, and in that brief instant, she saw something that shattered every assumption she'd carried about the enemy. She saw fear. She saw pain. She saw a human being who was just as scared and far from home as any of the Allied soldiers she'd treated. But there was something else in his eyes, something that made her breath catch, recognition, not of her specifically, but of what she represented, hope, someone who might help instead of harm. Someone who might see him as more than just a uniform. The German soldier tried to speak, his voice barely a whisper. The words came out in broken English, heavily accented, but clear enough to understand. He wasn't asking for mercy. He wasn't pleading for his life. He was asking about the other wounded. Were they being cared for? Were they safe? This wasn't what Margaret had expected from an enemy soldier. This was compassion from someone who should have been her opposite in every way. And it changed something fundamental in how she saw the war, the enemy, and herself. The head nurse, a stern woman named Sister Catherine, arrived moments later. She took one look at the situation and made a decision that surprised everyone. They would treat him, not because they wanted to, but because it was what they did. They were medical professionals first, patriots second. But treating him was one thing. What came next was something entirely different. As the days passed and the German soldier recovered, Margaret found herself drawn to his bedside more often than necessary. At first, she told herself it was professional curiosity. How did enemy medics treat similar wounds? What techniques did they use? Soon, though, she realized it was something else entirely. The man, who eventually told her his name was Klaus, wasn't the monster she'd been taught to hate. He was educated, speaking not just English but French as well. He'd been a medical student before the war, conscripted into service as a field medic. Like her, he'd spent the war trying to save lives rather than take them. Their conversation started simply enough: medical discussions, comparisons of techniques. But gradually, they became more personal. Klaus told her about his family's small farm in Bavaria, about his younger sister who wanted to become a teacher, about the books he'd read, and the places he'd dreamed of visiting before the world went mad. Margaret found herself sharing things she'd never told anyone. Her fears about the war, her doubts about whether anything they were doing really mattered, her dreams of what life might be like when the fighting finally stopped. In Klaus, she found someone who understood the weight of trying to heal in a world determined to destroy itself. But their growing connection wasn't happening in isolation. Other staff members began to notice how much time Margaret spent with the German patient. Some were suspicious, others were openly hostile. The war had taken too much from too many people for sympathy toward the enemy to come easily. Sister Catherine called Margaret aside one evening after a particularly long shift. The conversation was tense, but not unkind. Catherine had noticed the attachment forming and wanted to warn Margaret about the dangers. Not just the obvious ones about fraternizing with the enemy, but the deeper ones about opening your heart in wartime. Margaret knew the older woman was right, but knowing something and feeling it are two different things entirely. Every day that Klaus grew stronger, she found herself more conflicted. Part of her wanted him to recover quickly so he could be transferred to a proper prisoner of war camp and out of her life. Another part of her dreaded that day with an intensity that frightened her. The turning point came 3 weeks after Klaus's arrival. He was well enough to walk now, though he still favored his wounded shoulder. Margaret was changing his bandages when he did something that caught her completely off guard. He placed his hand gently over hers and thanked her. Not just for the medical care, but for treating him like a human being. The touch was brief, barely a second, but it sent electricity through both of them. Margaret pulled her hand away quickly, her cheeks burning with embarrassment and something else she didn't want to name. Klaus looked equally shaken, as if he couldn't believe what he'd just done. That night, Margaret lay awake staring at the ceiling of her small quarters, trying to make sense of what was happening to her. She was falling in love with a Nazi soldier. The thought should have horrified her. Instead, it terrified her because she knew it was true. Klaus was experiencing the same internal battle. He'd been raised to see the British as enemies of the German people, but Margaret had shown him kindness when she could have let him die. She talked to him like a person, not a prisoner. She'd shared her fears and dreams as if the uniforms they wore didn't matter at all. The hospital continued its grim work around them. New wounded arrived daily. Some recovered and returned to duty. Others weren't so fortunate. Through it all, Margaret and Klaus stole moments together, careful conversations that felt like the most natural thing in the world and the most forbidden act imaginable. But war has a way of forcing decisions before you're ready to make them. And soon, both Margaret and Klaus would face choices that would test everything they believed about duty, love, and what it means to be human when the world demands you be something else entirely. Their secret was about to become impossible to keep, and the consequences would change both their lives forever. Their lives forever. The first real test came when Klaus was strong enough to help around the hospital. Sister Catherine, despite her earlier warnings to Margaret, had made a practical decision. They were understaffed, overwhelmed, and Klaus had medical training. She assigned him to basic tasks under strict supervision, but it meant he was no longer confined to his bed. Working alongside Margaret felt both natural and impossible. Their hands would brush as they reached for the same supplies. Their eyes would meet across a wounded soldier's bed as they worked together to save a life. These moments of connection happened dozens of times each day, and each one felt like a small rebellion against the war that had brought them together. Other staff members watched these interactions with growing unease. Nurse Williams, a sharp-tongued woman from Manchester whose brother had died at Normandy, made her disapproval clear with cold stares and cutting remarks. She wasn't alone in her suspicions. The tension in the hospital grew thicker each day. Margaret could feel the weight of judgment pressing down on her shoulders. She tried to maintain professional distance from Klaus, but it felt like trying to hold back the tide. Every instinct told her to protect him, to shield him from the hostility that surrounded them both. Klaus sensed the danger too. He'd been a prisoner long enough to recognize the signs of changing attitudes. Some of the British soldiers who visited the hospital looked at him with barely contained rage. He knew that his presence was putting Margaret at risk, but he also knew that leaving would mean never seeing her again. Late one evening, when the hospital had finally quieted and most of the staff had retired, Margaret found Klaus sitting alone in the supply room. He was staring at his hands, the same hands that had once worn Wehrmacht gloves, now clean and gentle as they helped heal Allied soldiers. She approached quietly, her heart hammering against her ribs. They hadn't been alone together like this in days, not since Sister Catherine's warning. But seeing him there, looking so lost and vulnerable, broke down every barrier she'd tried to build. Klaus looked up when he heard her footsteps. The exhaustion in his eyes matched her own. Without speaking, she sat beside him on the wooden crate he'd been using as a chair. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything they couldn't say. Finally, Klaus spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. He told her about his dreams, the ones that woke him every night. Not nightmares about battle or injury, but dreams about going home to find his family gone, his sister dead, his village destroyed. Dreams about a world where everything he'd known before the war had simply vanished. Margaret listened without interrupting, understanding perfectly. She had her own nightmares about what came after the war ended, about returning to a normal life that no longer felt possible after everything she'd seen and done, about trying to forget faces and moments that had changed her forever. As Klaus spoke, Margaret realized something that should have frightened her but instead brought unexpected peace. She wasn't just falling in love with this man despite the war between their countries. She was falling in love with him because of how he'd responded to that war, because he'd chosen compassion over hatred, healing over destroying, humanity over ideology. Klaus must have seen something change in her expression because he stopped talking and looked directly into her eyes. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, carefully, as if they were handling something precious and fragile, they reached for each other. The kiss was gentle, tentative, filled with wonder and terror in equal measure. It lasted only seconds before they pulled apart, both breathing hard, both knowing they'd crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Margaret's mind raced with the implications. What they'd just done was treason in the eyes of many. It was betrayal of everything she'd been taught to believe. It was dangerous beyond measure for both of them, but it was also the most honest thing she'd felt since the war began. Klaus was struggling with the same realization. He'd been raised to see the British as enemies, but he'd found something in Margaret that made all the propaganda seem like lies. Her kindness wasn't weakness. Her compassion wasn't naivety. It was strength of a kind he'd never encountered before. They separated quickly when they heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Margaret's hand shook as she pretended to organize medical supplies. Klaus busied himself with inventory sheets, though the numbers blurred together on the page. Both of them knew that everything had changed, but neither knew what came next. The next few days passed in a haze of stolen glances and careful avoidance. Margaret threw herself into her work with renewed intensity, as if staying busy could somehow erase what had happened between them. Klaus did the same, but their efforts only made their connection more obvious to those who were watching. Nurse Williams finally confronted Margaret directly. She cornered her in the laundry room one afternoon, her face flushed with anger and disgust. The accusations came in a harsh whisper, each word designed to cut deep. Traitor, collaborator, Nazi lover. Margaret stood frozen as the verbal assault continued. Part of her wanted to defend herself, to explain that Klaus wasn't the monster Williams imagined him to be. But how could she explain something she barely understood herself? How could she make someone else see past the uniform to the man beneath? The confrontation ended with Williams delivering an ultimatum. Either Margaret ended whatever was happening with the German prisoner, or Williams would report her suspicions to the commanding officer. The threat hung in the air between them like poison gas. That night, Margaret lay awake again, but this time her thoughts were clearer than they'd been in weeks. She understood now that she had to make a choice. She could protect herself by pushing Klaus away, maintaining the professional distance that everyone expected. Or she could follow her heart, knowing that doing so might destroy both their lives. Meanwhile, Klaus was facing his own impossible decision. He'd recovered enough that he would soon be transferred to a permanent prisoner of war facility. The thought of leaving Margaret felt like dying, but staying meant putting her in even greater danger. He'd seen how some of the other staff looked at her now, the suspicion and hostility that followed her wherever she went. The decision was made for them 3 days later when news arrived that would change everything. A group of German prisoners had escaped from a facility in Scotland. Security was being tightened everywhere. All German prisoners, including those in medical facilities, were to be transferred immediately to high-security compounds. Klaus would be leaving within 24 hours. The news hit Margaret like a physical blow. She'd known this day would come, but knowing and experiencing are entirely different things. 24 hours to say goodbye to the person who'd become the most important thing in her world. 24 hours before she might never see him again. Sister Catherine delivered the news with characteristic efficiency, but Margaret caught something in the older woman's eyes that surprised her. Understanding, perhaps. Maybe even sympathy. Catherine had been young once, too. She'd lived through the last war and understood something about love and loss that she rarely showed. That evening, as the hospital settled into its nighttime routine, Margaret made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She couldn't let Klaus leave without telling him how she felt. She couldn't let him disappear into the prisoner of war system, believing that what they'd shared meant nothing to her. She found him in the small room where he'd been quartered, packing the few possessions he'd accumulated during his stay. The sight of him folding the simple clothes he'd been given, preparing to return to his prisoner uniform, broke something inside her chest. Klaus looked up when she entered, and she saw her own pain reflected in his eyes. Neither of them spoke at first. Words seemed inadequate for what was happening between them. Finally, Margaret found her voice. She told him things she'd never said to another human being. About the way he'd changed how she saw the world. About the peace she found in his presence. About the love she felt that transcended every boundary the war had tried to build between them. Klaus listened with tears in his eyes, understanding that she was giving him a gift more precious than life itself. When she finished speaking, he told her his own truth, that she'd saved more than his body that first night. She'd saved his soul, his faith in humanity, his belief that there was still good in a world gone mad. They held each other then, two people from opposite sides of a war, finding in each other's arms the only peace either had known in years. They made promises they both knew might be impossible to keep. Promises to find each other when the war ended. Promises to remember this love no matter what came next. But even as they spoke these words, both knew that morning would bring separation and uncertainty. Klaus would disappear into the prisoner system, and Margaret would remain at her post, carrying the secret of their love like a sacred trust. What neither of them knew was that someone had been watching. Someone who would soon make a decision that would threaten not just their love, but their very lives. The watcher was Nurse Williams, and her hatred had been growing like a cancer since that confrontation in the laundry room. She'd positioned herself where she could observe Margaret's movements, documenting every lingering glance, every moment of tenderness, every breach of what she considered proper conduct during wartime. Williams had lost more than her brother at Normandy. She'd lost her fiancé at Dunkirk, her cousin over the skies of London during the Blitz. The German uniform represented every personal tragedy she'd endured, and seeing Margaret treat their enemy with anything resembling affection felt like a betrayal of everyone who died, fighting against them. That final night, Williams watched through a crack in the door as Margaret and Klaus held each other. She saw the tears, heard the whispered promises, witnessed what she considered the ultimate act of treason. Her decision was made before they even separated. The next morning arrived gray and cold, matching the mood that had settled over the hospital. Klaus dressed in his original uniform, now clean and mended, the gray wool feeling foreign after weeks in civilian clothes. His wounded shoulder still ached, but the physical pain was nothing compared to what he felt knowing he might never see Margaret again. Margaret went through her morning routine like a sleepwalker, checking on patients, distributing medication, changing bandages. Her hands performed the familiar tasks while her heart prepared to break. Every minute that passed brought Klaus closer to departure, closer to disappearing from her life forever. Sister Catherine found her in the medicine storage room just after breakfast. The head nurse's expression was grave, her usual efficiency replaced by something that looked almost like sorrow. The commanding officer wanted to see Margaret immediately. No explanation given, but Catherine's eyes told the story that her words couldn't. Someone had reported the relationship. Someone had decided that love was a crime that needed punishment. Margaret's blood turned to ice water in her veins. She'd known this moment might come, but facing it felt like stepping off a cliff into darkness. Everything she'd worked for, everything she'd built, was about to crumble around her. The walk to the commanding officer's quarters felt endless. Each step echoed in the corridor like a death knell. Margaret tried to prepare herself for what was coming, but how do you prepare for the end of everything you've believed about yourself? Major Thornton was a career military man with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much war. He'd been running field hospitals since the fighting began, dealing with situations that weren't covered in any manual. But this particular problem was one he'd hoped never to face. The accusations came in clinical military language: fraternization with enemy personnel, conduct unbecoming a British officer, possible collaboration with enemy forces. Each charge felt like a physical blow, but Margaret stood straight and met his gaze without flinching. Williams had provided detailed testimony: times, dates, observations of inappropriate behavior. She'd painted a picture of systematic betrayal, of a nurse who'd forgotten her duty to her country in favor of personal feelings for the enemy. Major Thornton asked Margaret if the charges were true. The question hung in the air between them like a loaded weapon. Margaret could deny everything, claim that Williams was mistaken or lying. She could try to save her career, her reputation, her future. Instead, she told the truth. Yes, she developed feelings for the German prisoner. Yes, she treated him with compassion and kindness. Yes, she'd found in him something that transcended the artificial boundaries of war. She wouldn't apologize for seeing the humanity in someone who needed healing. The major listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When Margaret finished speaking, silence filled the room like poison gas. She could hear her own heartbeat, could feel her career disintegrating with each passing second. Finally, Thornton spoke. He'd been expecting denial, excuses, pleas for understanding. Instead, he'd received honest confession from someone who clearly understood the consequences of her choices. It complicated everything in ways he wasn't prepared for. The punishment, when it came, was swift and decisive. Margaret was to be transferred immediately to a facility far from any prisoner installations. Her service record would reflect conduct issues that would likely end any hope of advancement. She would continue serving as a nurse, but under constant supervision and suspicion. But there was more. Klaus was to be moved not just to a different facility, but to a high-security installation where prisoners had minimal contact with medical staff. The separation would be complete and permanent. Margaret accepted the sentence without protest. She'd known the risks, had chosen love over safety, and now she would pay the price. But even facing disgrace and exile, she couldn't bring herself to regret what she'd felt for Klaus. The transfer was scheduled for that afternoon. Margaret would leave first, followed by Klaus several hours later. They wouldn't be allowed to say goodbye, wouldn't be permitted any final contact. The war machine would grind on, separating them as efficiently as it had brought them together. Margaret spent her final hours at Whitmore Field Hospital completing her duties with characteristic thoroughness. She checked on every patient one last time, ensured that her replacement would have detailed notes on each case, organized supplies with military precision. But underneath the professional competence, her heart was shattering. She was losing Klaus, losing her position, losing the life she'd built for herself. Everything was changing, and she had no control over what came next. Klaus learned about Margaret's transfer from Sister Catherine, who delivered the news with uncharacteristic gentleness. The older woman had seen enough heartbreak during her years of service to recognize genuine love when she encountered it, even when that love violated every rule she'd sworn to uphold. The knowledge that Margaret was suffering because of their connection hit Klaus harder than any physical wound he'd endured. He'd brought this destruction into her life simply by existing, by being someone she could care about, despite every reason she had to hate him. He requested permission to see her one final time, to apologize for the harm he'd caused, to tell her that her sacrifice wouldn't be forgotten. The request was denied with military efficiency. Enemy prisoners didn't negotiate the terms of their confinement. Margaret's departure was as sudden as her sentencing. A military transport arrived after lunch, and she had 30 minutes to pack her belongings and report for transfer. No ceremony, no farewell from colleagues, no recognition of the years she'd devoted to saving lives. Sister Catherine was the only staff member who came to see her off. The head nurse's goodbye was brief but meaningful, a handshake that conveyed respect and understanding that couldn't be spoken aloud. Some bonds transcend regulation and protocol. As the transport pulled away from Whitmore Field Hospital, Margaret pressed her face to the small window for one last glimpse of the place that had changed her life forever. She couldn't see Klaus, couldn't know if he was watching from somewhere inside, but she sent her love toward the building anyway. Klaus stood at a window in the upper ward, watching the vehicle disappear into the distance. He was losing the most important person in his world, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The helplessness was more crushing than any physical pain he'd ever experienced. Hours later, his own transport arrived. The return to prisoner status was jarring after weeks of relative freedom within the hospital. The guards who accompanied him were professional but cold, treating him as cargo rather than a person who'd spent recent weeks saving lives alongside their own countrymen. The journey to his new facility took most of the night. Klaus stared out at the dark countryside, thinking about Margaret and wondering where she was being taken. The landscape looked peaceful in the moonlight, giving no hint of the war that continued to tear the world apart. His new prison was everything the hospital hadn't been. Cold, efficient, designed to contain rather than heal. The other prisoners were a mix of soldiers captured at various stages of the war, some defiant, others broken, all of them far from home and uncertain about their futures. Klaus threw himself into whatever medical duties he was permitted, treating fellow prisoners and occasionally injured guards. Work was the only thing that kept his mind from dwelling on what he'd lost, the only way to honor the compassion Margaret had shown him. Meanwhile, Margaret found herself assigned to a military hospital in northern Scotland, far from any prisoner facilities, far from any temptation to repeat her supposed crimes. The landscape was beautiful but harsh, matching her new reality perfectly. Her new colleagues had been briefed about her transfer, though the details were kept vague. She was competent, but under suspicion, skilled, but not to be trusted completely. The isolation was almost complete, but Margaret endured it with the same determination that had carried her through years of war. Both of them settled into their new routines, carrying their secret love like a flame that couldn't be extinguished by distance or disapproval. They had no way to communicate, no knowledge of each other's whereabouts, but the connection forged in those weeks at Whitmore remained unbroken. Winter deepened around them both, and still the war continued. News filtered through about battles won and lost, territories gained and surrendered, but none of it seemed to matter as much as the personal war each of them was fighting against despair and loneliness. Margaret wrote letters she could never send, pouring her heart onto pages that would never reach their intended recipient. Klaus did the same, creating a correspondence with someone who might as well have been on another planet for all the possibility of contact between them. But love has a way of surviving even the most impossible circumstances. And sometimes, when the world seems determined to keep two people apart, fate finds a way to intervene in the most unexpected manner possible. Neither Margaret nor Klaus knew it yet, but their story was far from over. The war that had separated them was finally beginning to turn, and with it would come opportunities neither of them could have imagined during those dark winter months of enforced separation. Separation. Spring arrived with unexpected news that would change everything. The war in Europe was collapsing, crumbling faster than anyone had predicted. German forces were retreating on all fronts, and rumors spread through both hospitals and prison camps that surrender might come within months rather than years. For Margaret, working in the Scottish Highlands, the approaching end of hostilities brought mixed emotions. Victory meant going home, returning to a world that had moved on without her. But it also meant uncertainty about Klaus, about whether he would survive whatever came next for German prisoners. Her duties remained the same, treating wounded soldiers who arrived daily from the European theater. Each face reminded her of Klaus, of the humanity she'd discovered beneath an enemy uniform. The work felt mechanical now, her hands performing familiar tasks while her heart remained elsewhere. The other nurses had gradually warmed to her presence, though whispers about her transfer still followed her through corridors. Professional competence eventually overcame suspicion, and Margaret found herself valued, if not entirely trusted, by her colleagues. Klaus experienced the changing war from behind barbed wire, watching fellow prisoners struggle with news from home. Some received letters telling of destroyed cities and missing families. Others heard nothing at all, left to imagine the worst about loved ones they might never see again. His medical skills kept him busy as prison conditions deteriorated with the influx of new captives. Resources stretched thin, and Klaus found himself treating everything from combat wounds to diseases of malnutrition. The work reminded him daily of lessons learned during those precious weeks with Margaret. Late at night, when the prison compound fell quiet except for guard patrols, Klaus would lie on his narrow bunk and remember conversations that had changed his understanding of everything. Margaret's voice echoed in his memory, speaking of hope and healing in a world determined to destroy itself. The other prisoners respected Klaus for his medical knowledge, but few understood the melancholy that seemed to follow him like a shadow. He spoke little about his time at the British Field Hospital, sharing only enough to explain his improved English and his familiarity with Allied medical techniques. News of Hitler's death reached both facilities within days of each other. The reaction was subdued in both places, as if everyone was afraid to believe that the end might actually be approaching. Too much hope had been crushed over too many years for celebration to come easily. Margaret received the news while tending to a young soldier who'd lost his leg to a landmine near Hamburg. The boy was barely 18, younger than Klaus had been when the war began. She wondered how many more would be wounded before the fighting finally stopped. For Klaus, Hitler's death brought no relief, only the terrible knowledge that his homeland was dying around a madman's legacy. Whatever came next for Germany, it would be built on the ashes of everything his generation had known. The future seemed as uncertain as it was inevitable. Then came May 8th, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The war that had consumed 6 years and millions of lives was officially over. Church bells rang across Britain while prisoners sat in stunned silence, trying to comprehend what peace might mean after so much destruction. Margaret stood outside her hospital that evening, watching fireworks bloom over distant hills. The celebration felt surreal after years of blackouts and air raids. But her thoughts weren't on victory or defeat. They were on a German medic who might be anywhere in the vast network of prisoner facilities scattered across Allied territory. Klaus heard the celebrations from his compound, distant sounds of joy that seemed to mock the despair filling every prisoner's heart. Peace meant survival, but it also meant an uncertain future in a world that would remember them only as enemies. Repatriation seemed impossible when there might be no home to return to. The weeks following surrender brought chaos as authorities struggled to process thousands of prisoners while determining their fates. Some would be released quickly. Others faced years of detention. A few might never go home at all, their crimes too serious for forgiveness. Klaus found himself classified as a medical prisoner, someone whose skills might be useful during the massive humanitarian crisis developing across Europe. It meant better treatment, but also longer detention. Freedom remained a distant possibility, rather than an immediate prospect. Margaret threw herself into caring for liberated concentration camp survivors who began arriving at Scottish hospitals. The skeletal figures haunted her dreams, reminders of what the war had really been about beneath all the propaganda and politics. Each patient reinforced her belief that healing transcended nationality. Treating these survivors also deepened her understanding of Klaus's struggle. He'd been part of a system that created such suffering, yet he'd chosen compassion over cruelty when given the chance. The contradiction was something she wrestled with during long shifts and sleepless nights. Months passed with no word about prisoner releases or repatriations. Margaret began to wonder if she would ever learn what had happened to Klaus, whether he'd survived the war's end or disappeared into the chaos-consuming post-war Europe. The uncertainty was almost worse than knowing he was lost forever. Letters from home spoke of rebuilding and moving forward, of young men returning to resume interrupted lives. But Margaret felt suspended between past and future, unable to forget what she'd experienced, yet uncertain how to build something new from the wreckage of wartime choices. Klaus adapted to extended imprisonment with the same quiet determination that had carried him through combat and captivity. He treated fellow prisoners, taught basic medical skills to those who wanted to learn, and tried to maintain hope that someday he might see his family again. The other prisoners often asked Klaus about his time in British hospitals, curious about enemy medical practices and whether their captors had shown any humanity. Klaus shared technical knowledge freely, but kept his deeper experiences private, protecting memories too precious for casual conversation. Winter arrived again, the first peacetime winter in 6 years, though peace felt relative when so many remained displaced, imprisoned, or lost. Margaret marked the anniversary of Klaus's departure from Whitmore Field Hospital by working a double shift, keeping her hands too busy for her heart to dwell on what might have been. Klaus marked the same anniversary by treating a prisoner who developed pneumonia in the drafty compound. As he worked to save the man's life, he thought about Margaret's hands guiding his during those first tentative medical collaborations. Her touch had taught him that healing could transcend every barrier humans created. Then, unexpectedly, change arrived in the form of a Red Cross initiative to utilize prisoner medical personnel in refugee camps. The massive displacement of people across Europe required every available medical professional, regardless of nationality or recent allegiance. Klaus volunteered immediately, seeing it as a chance to do meaningful work while potentially moving closer to eventual freedom. The screening process was extensive, involving interviews about his wartime service and his motivations for seeking the assignment. Margaret learned about the Red Cross program through official channels, as British medical personnel were also being recruited for refugee work. The opportunity to leave Scotland and engage in humanitarian work appealed to her, offering a chance to rebuild her career while serving a cause everyone could support. Neither knew that the other had applied for similar positions. Neither imagined that fate might be preparing another intersection of their lives, this time in service of healing rather than warfare. The refugee camps scattered across Europe would become the stage for the next chapter of their story. The approval process took months, but eventually both received their assignments. Margaret would be stationed at a displaced persons camp near Munich, working with survivors from across Eastern Europe. Klaus would be assigned to a similar facility outside Frankfurt, treating refugees and former prisoners alike. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that they were returning to German soil, Margaret as a liberator, and Klaus as something between prisoner and volunteer. Both would be working to heal wounds that went far deeper than anything they'd encountered during the fighting. Margaret's departure from Scotland came with mixed emotions. She'd found a kind of peace in the Highland Hospital, even if it came with isolation and suspicion. Leaving meant stepping back into an uncertain world where her past choices might continue to haunt her future. Klaus's transfer from the prison compound felt like resurrection after months of confinement. The journey to Frankfurt took him through devastated German cities, showing him the full extent of his homeland's destruction. Everything familiar had been transformed into something alien and broken. The refugee camp where Margaret was assigned defied description. Thousands of displaced persons living in temporary shelters, speaking dozens of languages, carrying stories of loss that could fill libraries. The medical needs were overwhelming, ranging from malnutrition to diseases of desperation. Klaus's camp was equally challenging, filled with people who'd lost everything except the will to survive. His status as a German prisoner initially created suspicion among refugees who'd suffered under German occupation, but his medical skills gradually earned acceptance and even gratitude. Both threw themselves into their work with the intensity of people seeking redemption through service. Margaret treated children who'd forgotten what safety felt like. Klaus helped elderly refugees whose families had vanished into the chaos of war's end. Neither spoke much about their own losses. The camps were managed by Allied authorities but staffed by an international mixture of professionals and volunteers. Communication was difficult, resources were limited, and the scale of human suffering seemed impossible to address adequately. Yet somehow, healing happened one patient at a time. Margaret found herself working alongside former enemies who, like Klaus, had chosen compassion over hatred. Polish doctors who treated German civilians, Russian nurses who cared for Ukrainian refugees, French volunteers who fed anyone who was hungry, regardless of nationality. Klaus discovered that suffering was a universal language that transcended the barriers war had tried to create. A child's fever responded to treatment whether that child was German, Polish, or Hungarian. Pain looked the same in every language, and so did relief when that pain was eased. Neither knew they were working barely 50 miles apart, separated by administrative boundaries rather than geography. Neither realized that their paths were converging again, drawn together by the same humanitarian impulse that had first connected them in a British field hospital. The work was exhausting but meaningful in ways that military medicine had never been. These patients weren't soldiers who would return to battle. They were human beings seeking nothing more than a chance to rebuild their lives after losing everything to forces beyond their control. Margaret began to understand that her love for Klaus hadn't been a betrayal of her values, but an expression of them. In choosing to see the person behind the uniform, she'd practiced the same. Compassion that now drove her work among refugees who'd been dehumanized by politics and prejudice. Klaus reached similar conclusions about his feelings for Margaret. She'd shown him that love could exist even in wartime, that humanity could survive even the most systematic attempts to destroy it. That lesson now guided everything he did in service of people who needed hope more than medicine. Both began to wonder if they would ever see each other again, if the connection forged in wartime could survive the complex realities of peace. Neither imagined that fate was already arranging their reunion, this time in circumstances that would test everything they'd learned about love, forgiveness, and the possibility of building something beautiful from the wreckage of war. The answer would come sooner than either expected, in a moment that would prove some bonds are stronger than the forces that try to break them. to break them. The reunion came through tragedy, as so many meaningful moments do in times of great upheaval. A cholera outbreak had swept through several camps in the region, overwhelming local medical resources and forcing emergency coordination between facilities that normally operated independently. Margaret received the urgent summons on a Tuesday morning while treating a young Romanian girl whose parents had disappeared somewhere between Budapest and the Austrian border. The message was brief and clinical, requesting immediate deployment to assist with epidemic containment at a facility near Frankfurt. She packed her medical supplies with practiced efficiency, her mind already shifting into crisis mode. Epidemic work was familiar territory after years of wartime medicine, but something about this assignment felt different. Perhaps it was the location, so close to where Klaus might be stationed, though she pushed such thoughts aside as unprofessional wishful thinking. Klaus learned about the outbreak when patients began arriving at his camp, refugees who'd fled the affected area carrying the disease with them. The German medical staff was overwhelmed, and Klaus found himself working 18-hour shifts trying to contain the spread while treating increasingly desperate cases. The coordination meeting was scheduled for dawn on Thursday at a central administrative building that served multiple camps in the region. Medical personnel from 6 facilities would gather to plan their response, share resources, and coordinate treatment protocols across language and nationality barriers. Margaret arrived early, her hands trembling slightly as she reviewed patient files and outbreak statistics. The scale of the crisis demanded complete focus, yet part of her mind kept wondering about the other medical staff she might encounter. 3 years had passed since that October night when Klaus left Whitmore Field Hospital, but she remembered every detail of his face with painful clarity. Klaus entered the meeting room just as the sun broke over. The horizon, his prisoner uniform replaced by civilian medical clothing that marked his volunteer status. He carried charts documenting infection rates and mortality statistics, his attention fixed on the data that would guide their epidemic response. The recognition was instantaneous and devastating. Across a room filled with doctors, nurses, and administrators from half a dozen countries, their eyes met with the same electric shock they'd felt during those stolen moments in a British hospital. Time collapsed, erasing 3 years of separation in a heartbeat. Margaret felt her breath catch in her throat, her carefully maintained professional composure cracking like ice under sudden pressure. Klaus looked older, thinner, marked by experiences she could only imagine. But his eyes held the same gentle intelligence that had first captured her heart when she knelt beside a wounded enemy soldier. Klaus gripped his charts tighter, using them as an anchor to reality while his world tilted off its axis. Margaret appeared like a vision from dreams he'd tried to suppress, more beautiful than memory had preserved, wearing the same expression of compassionate determination that had saved his life and soul. Neither moved for several seconds that felt like hours. Around them, other medical personnel took their seats and began discussing outbreak containment strategies in multiple languages. The urgent business of saving lives continued while 2 people processed the miracle of finding each other again. The meeting organizer, a British colonel with exhausted eyes and coffee-stained uniform, called for attention and began outlining the crisis they've faced. 17 confirmed deaths, over 200 suspected cases, and the disease spreading faster than their current resources could manage. Margaret forced herself to focus on the briefing, taking notes with hands that shook despite her efforts at control. She absorbed information about water purification, quarantine protocols, and medication distribution, while her peripheral vision remained acutely aware of Klaus sitting 3 tables away. Klaus struggled similarly, his medical training warring with emotional chaos as he tried to process epidemiological data, while the woman he'd never stopped loving sat within touching distance. He answered technical questions about treatment protocols while his heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird. The assignments were distributed based on expertise and availability rather than nationality or previous allegiances. Margaret found herself designated as lead nurse for the isolation ward at Klaus's facility, while Klaus was assigned as primary physician for the same unit. They would be working together again, this time fighting disease instead of war. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that they were being reunited to battle an enemy that recognized no borders, respected no uniforms, and threatened everyone equally. Cholera was a democratic killer that required cooperation across every artificial boundary humans had created. After the meeting, as other personnel dispersed to their assignments, Margaret and Klaus found themselves walking in the same direction toward the transport vehicles. Neither spoke initially, both overwhelmed by emotions too complex for casual conversation in such a public setting. Klaus broke the silence first, his voice rough, with suppressed feeling. He asked about her work, her health, whether she'd found peace in the years since their separation. The questions were carefully neutral, designed to maintain professional appearances while his eyes conveyed everything he couldn't say aloud. Margaret responded with equal caution, inquiring about his family, his medical work, his treatment in the prisoner system. They spoke like polite colleagues while their hearts screamed with joy and relief and terror at this unexpected second chance. The ride to Klaus's camp passed in charged silence, both acutely aware of the other's presence while maintaining careful physical distance. Margaret studied the devastated landscape rolling past the truck windows, trying to process the reality that she was returning to Germany as a liberator rather than an enemy. Klaus watched Margaret from across the vehicle, noting changes that 3 years had carved into her face. New lines around her eyes spoke of suffering and responsibility. Her hands moved with even greater confidence than before, shaped by experiences he could only guess at. The camp itself was larger than Whitmore Field Hospital had ever been, a sprawling collection of temporary structures housing thousands of displaced persons. The medical facility occupied several converted barracks, equipped with whatever supplies the Red Cross had managed to procure and transport. Their first patients together were 2 Polish children, siblings who'd contracted cholera while searching for their parents among the refugee population. Margaret and Klaus worked side by side, their professional partnership resuming as naturally as breathing despite the years of separation. The familiar rhythm of medical collaboration felt like coming home after a long and difficult journey. Margaret anticipated Klaus's needs before he asked, handing him instruments and supplies with the same intuitive timing she remembered from their time together. Klaus found himself trusting her judgment completely, as if no time had passed since their last case together. Margaret and Klaus learned that some connections transcend war, nationality, and time itself. Their love story proves that even in humanity's darkest moments, compassion can bridge any divide. Working together again in those refugee camps, they discovered that their forbidden wartime romance had grown into something deeper, a partnership built on shared values of healing and hope. Love doesn't always conquer all, but sometimes it conquers enough.